She walked into that courtroom like she had already won. 17 years old, composed, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. People in that room described her as calm, almost eerily so for a teenager facing a murder charge that could take the next 15 years of her life. But here's what nobody in that courtroom knew yet. The prosecution had something she hadn't fully prepared for. Something that didn't care about her lawyers, her story, or the carefully constructed image she had spent a year building. And the moment it played on that screen, every person in that room watched Mackenzie Sharilla's confidence begin to crack. There were moments that friends and family would later describe to investigators in detail. Moments that, taken individually, might seem like the ordinary turbulence of young love, but taken together, began to paint a very different picture. What no one around her could have imagined was what she was allegedly capable of. Because on that July night, something happened on a quiet street in Strongsville that would force an entire community to ask a question nobody wanted to answer. How well do we really know the people closest to us? July 31st, 2022. Just after 5 in the morning. A Toyota Camry carrying 3 people accelerated down Progress Drive in Strongsville. Inside the car were Mackenzie Sharilla, her boyfriend Dominic Russo, and their mutual friend Davion Flanagan. Dominic was 20 years old, Davion was 19, Mackenzie was 17. The car was traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour when it left the roadway and slammed directly into a brick building. There was no attempt to brake, no skid marks, no swerve. The vehicle struck the structure with catastrophic force. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were killed. Mackenzie Sharilla survived. When first responders arrived at the scene, what they found was described as devastating. The car was almost unrecognizable. Emergency workers documented the wreckage and the victims. Mackenzie was transported to Metro Health Hospital with serious injuries. In those first hours, investigators treated it as a traffic accident, a tragic early morning crash involving 3 young people. But even as Mackenzie was being treated in the hospital, certain details were already beginning to feel wrong. Investigators were not at the scene long before something started to shift in their thinking. The black box data from the vehicle, the event data recorder that captures speed, braking, throttle input, and steering behavior in the moments before a crash, told a story that didn't match any version of a tragic accident. The data showed the car traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour. It showed the throttle was applied, and it showed something that stopped investigators cold. There was no braking, not a tap of the pedal, nothing. In the final seconds before that car struck that building, no attempt was made to stop it. Investigators also had access to surveillance footage from the area. When they pulled that video and watched it, they saw a car that did not drift, did not swerve unexpectedly, did not lose control in any way that suggested a medical emergency or driver error. What the footage showed was a vehicle that accelerated in a direct line toward a fixed structure. But investigators noticed something else. Something that made the medical explanation Mackenzie's defense would later offer far harder to accept. Witnesses at the scene, first responders, people who were there in those immediate minutes, none reported behavior consistent with someone who had suffered a sudden medical blackout. And the questions about Mackenzie's state of mind in those hours would only grow more complicated the deeper investigators looked. Her story was already beginning to unravel, and the crash had barely happened. To understand what investigators believed was behind the events of July 31st, you have to go back further. Because the night of the crash did not exist in isolation. According to prosecutors, it was the final act of a relationship that had been deteriorating for months, and a pattern of behavior that, once investigators began documenting it, was impossible to explain away as coincidence. Mackenzie and Dominic's relationship had become characterized by conflict. Friends and family members would later describe threats Mackenzie had allegedly made, statements that escalated over time and that several people claimed they had heard directly. According to court records, Mackenzie had on one occasion threatened to key Dominic's car. On another, she allegedly threatened to break the handle off a door after he refused to let her inside his home. But the most chilling alleged statements were the ones she made about the car itself. According to testimony presented at trial, Mackenzie had made direct threats involving the vehicle. Statements to the effect that she would crash the car. These weren't vague or ambiguous. They were specific. And prosecutors would argue at trial that those words were not the reckless hyperbole of an angry teenager. They were a declaration of intent. spoken out loud, long before that night. There were also accounts suggesting she had driven that route before. That Progress Drive was not an unfamiliar street. That what happened in the early hours of July 31st may not have been the first time that road was considered. Investigators weren't building a theory. They were following a trail, and every step they took led them further away from the word accident. If you want more real cases where the truth hides in plain sight, stories of women, relationships, hidden motives, and the evidence that finally breaks through, subscribe to Her Case Files. New cases every week. Now let's get back to where the story gets darker. 3 months after the crash, on November 4th, 2022, Mackenzie Sherilla was arrested. The charge was aggravated murder.
Hi, Mackenzie. Step out for me. I'm Detective Hazoo. I'm the one who's been investigating the crash. You're under arrest for aggravated murder ×2, okay? Nobody's gonna ask you any questions. Nobody's gonna bother you. Can I have your key, please?
Could you please be careful taking this one off so it doesn't break the bracelet, please?
You got it. You got it.
You want my glasses?
No.
Thank you.
You got it. Okay, just keep your hands right here. I'm not gonna tighten these, okay? I don't want to hurt you. You good? Are they good? We're gonna watch your head going in.
Southbound on rural from Portland. You might stand John Davis Lincoln, 7-3. The caller's coming up. Disregard.
Calling partner. Partner, make sure that the juvenile fact sheet that gets filled out in the jail is the county one, not the SPD one. Okay.
Get a unit to Drake and Pearl to block traffic, so I have a lot of cars coming down this way. Yeah. Somebody want 7-4? Go ahead. Yeah, to Drake and Pearl.
Yeah, copy that around. You want me to shut straight down? 35?
Sorry. It's just like...
Stand right by that black mat. Straight forward. Yep. Until that door. Step on that yellow line and just face the wall.
Yeah, I'm talking to you.
What is Mackenzie?
Okay, Mackenzie, I want to take your handcuffs off. I need like all the jewelry and everything to come off, okay?
I can't wear any of it.
No, I need you to take it off while you're in jail right now.
I can't wear these.
Now, unfortunately, everything's gonna have to come off right now once we know when the detective comes back and we know for sure what's going on. Everything's gonna be good.
Moved to arrest her, they had assembled a picture of the case that went far beyond the black box data and the surveillance footage. They had gone through phones, they had documented the prior threats, they had spoken to people who knew the relationship from the inside, and they had something else, something Mackenzie herself had given them, in a room where she believed she was simply receiving medical care. In the hours immediately following the crash, while Mackenzie was being treated at Metro Health, she spoke to hospital staff. These were not formal statements made to police. They were not recorded interrogations. They were the words of a teenager in a hospital bed, injured, emotional, and not yet thinking about how every sentence she uttered might one day be read aloud in a courtroom. According to medical records that were entered into evidence at trial, Mackenzie told hospital staff that she wanted to die. And she said something else, something the prosecution would return to again and again as the trial unfolded. She told them it was her fault for killing her boyfriend, not an accident, not a terrible thing that happened to her. Her fault, her words, documented in a medical record before any attorney had spoken to her, before any legal strategy had been constructed, before she had any reason to manage what she was saying. That sentence would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, and it would directly contradict everything she would claim for the next year. When the trial began in August of 2023, the defense had constructed what appeared on the surface to be a coherent strategy. Mackenzie had a medical condition, a blood pressure disorder called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which can cause sudden drops in blood pressure and in some cases, momentary blackouts. The defense argued that what happened on Progress Drive was not intentional, that Mackenzie may have lost consciousness, that no one could say with certainty what had happened inside that car in the seconds before impact, and that without certainty, a murder conviction was legally impossible to sustain. The defense leaned hard into reasonable doubt. The attorney outlined scenario after scenario, Dominic grabbing the wheel, a sudden panic response, an involuntary acceleration, not to prove any single one of them, but to suggest that the space between accident and murder was too wide, too uncertain, too human to cross beyond a reasonable doubt. They also worked to humanize Mackenzie. She was 17 at the time of the crash. She had lost people she cared about. She had been injured herself. Whatever happened, they argued, she was not a cold-blooded killer. She was a teenager caught in a tragedy she couldn't fully explain, because she genuinely could not remember it. It was a structured, professional defense, and for a time the courtroom appeared to be listening. Then the prosecution began to respond. The prosecutor's approach was methodical. They did not rush. They did not overreach. They built the case the way investigators had built it, piece by piece, each layer more damaging than the last. They started with the black box. The data was not subject to interpretation. The car had been traveling at approximately 100 miles per hour. The throttle was engaged. There was no braking input recorded in the final moments before impact. The prosecution presented this not as a theory, but as mechanical fact, the car's own record of what had happened, indifferent to any story told afterward. Then came the surveillance footage. The court watched the crash on video. They saw the car move. They saw the trajectory. And what the footage showed was a vehicle traveling in a controlled, direct path before impact, not the erratic, last-second movement of a driver suddenly incapacitated. But investigators noticed something else the defense had not fully accounted for, the medical record. When Dr. Esther Singh, the trauma surgeon who had been part of Mackenzie's care at Metro Health, was called to testify, she read directly from the documented record. The courtroom heard the words Mackenzie had spoken just hours after the crash. Patient stated it was her fault for killing her boyfriend. The defense attempted to soften the blow. During cross-examination, the attorney suggested that admitting fault was not the same as admitting intent. That those words did not say she had done it on purpose. Dr. Singh confirmed that the note said what it said. No more, no less. But the damage was already done. Because those words, spoken privately, before any legal strategy existed, were now on the record. And they stood in direct contradiction to the story Mackenzie had been telling ever since. Her explanation was falling apart in real time. What happened next shocked the courtroom in a way that even the black box data hadn't. The prosecution introduced social media evidence. Not character evidence designed to make Mackenzie look like a bad person, but specific content the prosecutors argued reflected her actual state of mind during the period when her relationship with Dominic was deteriorating and the threats were escalating. TikTok videos, posts Mackenzie had made herself, in her own words, using her own accounts. Content that she had put into the world voluntarily, never imagining it would be played on a screen in a murder trial. One post carried the caption, "I'm the one you die for." Another, posted around the same period, included the line, "I'm not even cool. I'm just one of those girls who can do a lot of drugs and not die." These were not posts from years earlier. According to court records, they were from the period directly surrounding the conflict with Dominic, the same window of time when the alleged threats were being made and the relationship was coming apart. The prosecution did not claim these posts proved the murder. What they argued was more precise, that this content demolished the image the defense was selling, the grieving, overwhelmed, memory-impaired teenager who would never intentionally hurt anyone, who called him her soulmate, because that same girl had posted publicly that she was the one you die for. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan sitting in that courtroom, families who had welcomed Mackenzie into their lives, who had trusted her, watching those posts appear on a screen in a murder trial was described as devastating. And the prosecution was not finished. There was one more layer prosecutors wanted the court to see. One more piece of the picture that closed whatever gaps the defense was trying to hold open. Shortly after the crash, while two young men were dead and an investigation was underway, Strongsville police were notified of something unusual. Emails had been sent to a Los Angeles modeling agency. A TikTok comment had been made. Mackenzie, or someone acting on her behalf, appeared to be exploring opportunities. In one message read into the record during trial, she wrote to the agency, "Thank you for the comment. I would love to work with you guys. I've been emailing you guys a lot. Such a great opportunity." The prosecution presented this as evidence of something the defense could not explain with POTS or memory loss or grief, because a person truly shattered by what had happened, truly believing they had survived a nightmare accident that killed two people they loved, does not email modeling agencies. Investigators weren't convinced by the performance of grief, and now the court wasn't either. By this point in the trial, the defense's portrait of Mackenzie, the innocent, heartbroken, medically vulnerable teenager, had been replaced by something far more complicated. The prosecution had shown the court her own data, her own footage, her own words from the hospital, her own social media, and her own emails. Nothing had been fabricated. Nothing had been taken wildly out of context. Every piece of evidence had come from Mackenzie herself. Her story had not survived contact with her own record. On August 14, 2023, after a bench trial, meaning the verdict rested with the judge alone, not a jury, the court delivered its findings. Mackenzie Shirilla was found guilty of murder in the death of Dominic Russo, guilty of murder in the death of Davion Flanagan, guilty of felonious assault, guilty of aggravated vehicular homicide, guilty on all counts. The judge did not find this a close case. In describing the evidence, the court used specific language to characterize what had occurred. The actions were described as controlled, methodical, deliberate, intentional, purposeful. These were not the words of a court that had been persuaded there was reasonable doubt. These were the words of a judge who had looked at everything, the black box, the footage, the medical record, the prior threats, the social media, the post-crash emails, and reached a conclusion that the evidence demanded. 7 days later, sentencing took place. And that is when Mackenzie stood up to speak. She asked the judge if she could stand to deliver her statement. Observers noted the request. Even in this moment, she wanted control of how she was seen. What she said was brief. She addressed the families of Dominic and Davion. She said she was deeply sorry. She said she hoped they would one day see that she would never let this happen or do it on purpose. She said she wished she could remember what happened. She said Dominic was her soulmate. She thanked her own family for their support and love. Then she said she was done, and she sat down. On the surface, it was composed, rehearsed, emotionally calibrated. But listen to what that statement actually contained. She still claimed she couldn't remember. She still maintained it wasn't intentional. She spent as much of her statement thanking her own family as she did addressing the families of the two people who had died. Body language analysts who reviewed the courtroom footage noted something that went beyond the words. As the judge described the nature of her crimes during sentencing, Mackenzie shook her head, back and forth, a visible, physical rejection of what was being said about her. One analyst noted that to have a defendant shaking their head no during sentencing is unusual, and that it suggests someone who still has not accepted the reality of what the court has determined she did. Compare that moment to what she had told hospital staff hours after the crash. It was her fault. Her words, her admission, before the lawyers, before the strategy, before the year of preparation for trial. The contrast was not subtle. Then Mackenzie's mother, Natalie Sharilla, addressed the court. Even after days of evidence, the black box, the footage, the medical record, the threats, the route, Natalie stood before the judge and called what happened a terrible, tragic nightmare accident. She said her daughter had no memory of it. She said Mackenzie had almost died too. Legal observers noted that this statement revealed something significant about the environment Mackenzie had grown up in. An environment where, even faced with overwhelming evidence of premeditation, the framing was still accident. The framing was still victimhood. The accountability that the prosecution had argued was entirely absent from Mackenzie's character appeared to be absent from the family's response as well. Natalie also asked the judge not to run the sentences consecutively. The request was denied. Mackenzie Sharilla was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. Her first parole hearing is currently scheduled for 2037. She will be in her early 30s. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office stated they remained fully confident in the conviction. The conviction was appealed. The 8th District Court of Appeals reviewed the case and rejected the appeal. The Ohio Supreme Court declined to take it up. Then, in 2026, renewed attention came to the case when Netflix released a documentary called The Crash, which examined the events in detail and brought the story to a global audience. In the wake of that release, Strongsville police responded to an avalanche of public records requests and released thousands of documents, including jail phone calls, body camera footage, and nearly 93,000 text messages from Mackenzie's phone. New attorneys filed yet another appeal with the Ohio Supreme Court in April of 2026, arguing in part that a procedural deadline had been missed due to a miscalculation involving leap year, 1 day. They also argued ineffective assistance of counsel. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office called for the appeal to be dismissed. As of this recording, the Ohio Supreme Court has not announced whether it will hear the case. The family of Dominic Russo has responded to the renewed attention by pushing for changes to Ohio law, specifically to ensure that Mackenzie Sharilla cannot profit from Dominic's death through media deals, documentaries, or any public platform. They are calling it Dom's Law. Dominic was 20 years old. Davion Flanagan was 19. Here's what this case ultimately reveals, beneath all the evidence and the courtroom drama and the legal arguments. Mackenzie Sharilla's undoing was not the surveillance footage. It was not the black box. It was not even the TikToks or the modeling emails, damaging as all of those were. Her undoing was a single sentence spoken in a hospital room on the morning of July 31st, 2022, before any attorney had reached her, before any strategy had been formed, before she understood that the words she said to a trauma surgeon would one day be read aloud to a judge deciding her fate. It was her fault for killing her boyfriend. That sentence existed before the defense did. It existed before the memory loss narrative. It existed before the POTS diagnosis and the reasonable doubt arguments and the carefully crafted sentencing statement. And no amount of legal preparation could make it disappear because it had already been written down. The most dangerous moments in any case are the ones people don't know are being recorded. The ones where the performance stops, the strategy hasn't started, and what's left is just the truth. In Mackenzie Shirilla's case, that moment lasted long enough to matter. Subscribe to Her Case Files. Every day, a new story. Real cases, real women, real consequences. We'll see you in the next one.